Any discussion of the far future is incomplete without considering a gray scenario, one that is the darling of science fiction and the sum of human fears. The apocalypse, a global event in which our fragile civilization collapses, possibly engineered by human hand, by a massive asteroid, by a raging virus. These events do not have a probability of zero, and therefore must be taken seriously. Let us imagine that through human negligence or just bad luck, such an event has happened. You are left with the remains of a broken civilization, without access to electricity, the internet, telephones, or even a reliable source of food. Yes, you might be able to survive for a while, maybe even years, but at some point the momentum and the resources from the fallen society will run out. Do you know how to grow food? To purify water? To capture electricity in a homemade battery? Will you know how to rediscover and utilize the incredible inventions of the past? In 2014, an astrophysicist named Dartnell wrote a book. It was called The Knowledge: How to Rebuild Our World from Scratch. It is an instructional manual of sorts, not for skills of survival, but for the cultivation and reinvention of a technologically advanced civilization. It is a civilization seed. When planted in the mind that is curious, industrious, and resilient, this seed has the ability to bear civilizational fruit, to possibly bring humanity back from the brink of extinction. Dartnell's book isn't meant to save the world. It's a piece of art, a reminder of our achievements as a species, a spark that lets you see the technological marvels around you in a new light. And as a warning, for this planetary ecosystem is a house of cards, fragile, complex, and worth protecting. Let us begin with a quote from T.S. Elliot and ask, which fragments are best shorn against our ruins? My name is Robert Roach, and this is the Type 1 Planet podcast. We are dedicated to building the foundation for a sustainable, globally stable civilization that could thrive for the next 10,000 years. Watch or listen to this episode on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and visit us at type1planet.net.
Hello, Lewis Dartnell. It's an honor meeting you. Thank you so much for coming on Type 1 Planet.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me, Rob. I've been looking forward to this chat.
Oh, man. So we are here to talk about some of the concepts and the philosophy behind your internationally best-selling book, The Knowledge: How to Rebuild Civilization in the Aftermath of a Cataclysm. So I had the pleasure, first of all, of listening to your book. And as a side note, the reader of your book on Audible is arguably, in my opinion, the most legendary Audible reader ever, John Lee. So to our listeners out there, I highly recommend it.
Do you know some of John Lee's other recordings as well?
Oh, my Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers. He did 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It's incredible work.
He's got an incredible voice. So as a brief aside before we actually start the interview, the publishers gave me the opportunity to read my own audiobook, and I said a hard no immediately. Like, my skills lie in researching and writing. I'm not a vocal actor. It is not as simple as reading the words on a page in terms of putting the right inflection and rhythm and everything on it. So they let me choose who could be my voice in the audiobook of The Knowledge. And I jumped at Lee. He's got such an incredible sort of cadence behind his voice.
I always love when authors read their own books. My only exception is John Lee. I was so excited. I yelled when I saw he was reading it. So that's so great. Well, so let's talk about this book. You have said that this book is not about learning how to survive from day to day in a catastrophic scenario, but rather it's about orchestrating a newly technologically advanced society after the fall. Now, from a scientific research perspective, you're an astrobiologist. You look at the possibility of life off of Earth. How did that perspective gained from your scientific work inspire the creation of this book?
Yeah, so my research field, what I do at the University of Westminster here in London, I've got a research lab with PhD students studying in it. My focus of my research is whether there is a possibility of life on Mars. And if there is hardy, extremophile bacteria surviving in the dry, dusty surface of Mars, what would be the best way to go and look for it? What biosignatures, what signs of life would we want to try to look for, and what sort of experiments and scientific instruments would we design and put on the front of a Mars rover to try to find those biosignatures? So that's the focus of my research. But astrobiology as a field is very interdisciplinary. I came from a biology background. I have astrobiology friends and colleagues who've come from geology or chemistry or physics or astronomy, as well as robotics, of course. And so bringing that sort of interdisciplinary approach from not just my research, but into the books that I write as well. So The Knowledge and Fact was my third book. I have a book that's come out since called Origins, How the Earth Shaped Human History, which looks at aspects of the planet, fundamental features of our Earth in terms of plate tectonics or the circulation of the atmosphere or where different metals are found in different resources. How has that had an influence on human history? So for all of my books, I've tried to bring this interdisciplinary approach, bringing in research and understanding and knowledge from many different areas of science. And with the knowledge, I never, to be honest, never genuinely set out to write a manual for rebuilding after an apocalypse. I don't think the world is imminently about to end. At least I sincerely hope not. So I'm not a prepper or survivalist in that sense. But I thought the notion that the idea of the rug being pulled out from beneath our feet, of everything we just take for granted in our everyday lives disappearing tomorrow, and then asking the question about how could you go about recovering and rebooting civilization and making and doing things from scratch yourself. I thought the notion of the apocalypse was a really good way of sort of peering behind the scenes of the modern world and answering sort of thought-provoking questions like that.
And you quoted, actually, in the introduction of this book is absolutely fabulous. And you quoted Arthur C. Clarke, and you said, who said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And then you continued and you said, after the fall, the rub is that this incredible technology would belong not to a starfaring species, but to a generation of human beings, one or two generations in the past.
Yeah, exactly, to our own recent ancestors. And this is a very common trope of a lot of post-apocalyptic sci-fi literature as well. Finding a little black oblong thing in the dust and ashes of a city. And of course, today we'd recognize that, as a smartphone, as an iPhone. But if you can't turn it on, its function is absolutely mystical. You couldn't work it out just by looking at it. It is, for all intents and purposes, a lump of magic, unless you understand about the principles behind it, how it works, and what it was designed to do in our world.
So we're trying to get as far away from magic as possible, which I love. But the descriptions you use, there is a bit of magic there, because you talk about this, this. I call it, just from reading it, the civilization seed, something that you're not trying to print out all of Wikipedia. You're attempting to create something that you can throw into a small body of human beings, and civilization sprouts out. So how did you design this book from that perspective?
Yes, I suppose the problem with trying to store a sum total of human knowledge of everything that we know, and even something like Wikipedia, although it is a vast trove of human knowledge, it still doesn't even come close to what you would actually genuinely need as a step-by-step guide of going from sort of hunter-gatherer or subsistence type existence to modern industrial civilization, because it's all about the pathway that you need to take as well, about getting the foundation blocks and then combining those in different ways, whether that's different bits of knowledge and understanding or technology and machinery, and combining those in different ways to build the next level, and then so on and so forth. And Wikipedia is a great sort of snapshot of the world today, but it is relatively light on historical development, particularly of technologies, and the amount of detail it gives in the actual operating principle, how something really works. But just as critically, how could you put that together and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps if you don't already have an example to look at and copy? So if we wanted to do that for real, and again, I hasten to point out that the book that I wrote, The Knowledge, is not a genuine attempt at encompassing everything that we would need to know. But I think that principle of boiling it down into its very essence, a sort of condensed kernel of knowledge, the seed, as you put it, might be a better approach, because it will develop and grow over time in step with the society and the recovering civilization as it goes, and they'll be able to fill in the gaps themselves rather than you having to write everything down ahead of time. So the last chapter I give in the book, I think the chapter title is the greatest invention of them all. And the idea behind this is that science itself, or at least the scientific method, the way that we explore the natural world and spot patterns in how things happen, and then write laws and descriptions of those patterns, all that scientific method is in essence itself an invention. We had to invent an effective and efficient way of conducting science and generating new knowledge from the early 1500s. So in that sense, the great invention of the whole of civilization is that of science, the invention that allows you to work out and discover everything else that you need, and how you make those tools for science, the things you use to measure or observe the natural world.
A noticeable part of that chapter is it made me realize how little of cultural instruction there is in your book. And I think you've said in previous interviews that you purposely did not just include information on how democracy works and consensus and voting and all these other important things we figured out. But does that information not help us a bit in terms of skipping over feudal periods and it's burgeoning society could really benefit from that kind of information?
Yes, I think you are absolutely right that there is more to a healthy, smoothly running society than just knowledge of technology and science, and I would never pretend otherwise. But there's two answers to that. The first one is, at the end of the day, the book is a conceit. It obviously doesn't contain everything you would need to remake a society from scratch. And at the end of the day, you have to write something which is hand-sized, and the publishers are willing to publish, and bookshops will stock so that people can actually get access to it and read it. So as a scientist writing a popular science book for what the publishers call the sort of trade market, the mass market, just everyday people on the street. This isn't an encyclopedia. It's not an academic textbook. It's just something I want to write for people to pick up and sort of read through. There's only so much you can cram in and still keep the sort of levity and the interest of the book. But I think there's a second and deeper point that's important here as well, is it would perhaps actually be irrelevant if you were to write some kind of 10-step guide to founding your own democratic government. Because some things, and particularly sociological things, they just take time to develop. There is no shortcut. And it took a long, long period of history, hundreds of years in Britain and Europe, and then around the world to develop democratic systems of governance. From the Magna Carta and the wrestling of power from the sovereign king or queen down to the nobility, and then into the peasants, the rest of us. That was a long, slow process of fighting for rights and protecting them. And you could write a 10-step guide to how to make a parliamentary or constitutional democracy from scratch, but whoever's got the biggest guns or most swords will still be the person who gets to call the shots.
Right.
But it is different, however, with science and technology that can be encapsulated, that can be boiled down to its essence. And no matter who you are or where you are in the world or what period of history in the past or in the future you might find yourself, there are still just fundamental things that the human body needs to survive or to be comfortable, or that society needs to function and provide the raw materials for itself. And so that information you can meaningfully put in a science book. And so it's mostly that area that I focused on in the book, in the knowledge, rather than aspects of culture or sociology or sort of governance, as you say. And I completely, overlook things like literature and music. And you would obviously want to preserve that cultural heritage as well to make life after the apocalypse worth living, and give that meaning to the human existence.
Well, I think, and it's funny because I found that this work is an alignment with the Type 1 Planet mission, not because of the instructions, but because of the artistry behind this book. It is intended to be something that is easy to pick up, and it is designed to get the person's brain thinking. And what it did for me is when I read it, I was able to look at all the technologies I'm surrounded with completely new eyes and say, I'm understanding some of the basics, and also the history is really important here, like you mentioned. And so you were able to walk a line between technical instruction and technical science with pop science, and also creating something that is artistically valuable to people. So tell me about, we're going to start getting into the philosophical framework here. It's not about just, it's not the, let's get into the why is this book useful, and think about some of also the tougher questions. One of them that I have is, in the scenario of a nuclear apocalypse, the civilization model of humanity will have failed to protect themselves and the diversity of life on this planet. And people struggle with hope a lot these days, and it's something that I think that we're thinking about. So how do we look at the system we have right now and say, yes, there's things here that are working, and there's things here that are worth protecting and worth bringing forward to future generations? How do those thoughts happen in your mind when you're writing something like this?
Yeah, so to pick up on your first point, my guiding principle, the thing I kept in the back of my mind through the whole process of researching and writing the book, was that thing you hinted at about, I tried very hard to make the everyday and the commonplace suddenly seem unfamiliar. I tried to hold up a mirror to our society and the way that we do things to make it seem unfamiliar, to force that question of, oh, that's interesting. Why do we do it this way rather than an alternative? How else might it be done? How could you progress through history a second time round more quickly, by leapfrogging between things, or avoiding, so cul-de-sacs or avenues of progress and development that ended up not leading anywhere particularly quickly? But if we take the premise of the book literally, and there has been some kind of global catastrophe, some kind of apocalypse, whether it's a nuclear Armageddon or a viral pandemic that wipes out a huge fraction of the human population, or an asteroid strike or whatever, or if we perhaps focus only on the sort of human-caused disasters, I think the survivors would still want to recover some semblance of society and then civilization for themselves, because civilization does an enormous amount for the individuals. It's civilization, basically invention for lazy people. You get a huge economy of scale. You get niche and role specialization. So in simpler, less complex societies, you would have everyone doing largely the same thing. Everyone would be gathering some food for themselves. Everyone would be making their own tools, whether it's out of stone or whatever. But as you progress to higher and higher complexities of civilization, every person gets to focus on doing one thing really well, and then relying on that collective productivity of everyone else in your civilization to make everything else that you need. And overall, that's better for everyone. We get to live more comfortable lives within that network of capability and productivity. So even if we could argue that civilization had failed by collapsing, by having some sort of human-triggered apocalypse, you would still want to try to recover civilization to make your life easier, to make the daily grind less onerous, and your existence to be less brutal. And if we look at history as well, we see that the collapse of civilizations, or the decline of civilizations at least, is probably the norm of history. And if anything, our modern globalized civilization, which for various reasons of colonialism and empire building is effectively descendant of medieval Europe, those hundreds of years of relatively steady progress and development from Middle Ages Europe to today is a historical freak. It's an anomaly. Most other empires, most other civilizations have had a rise and a fall. There's been catastrophic collapses of civilizations in South America, for example, and around the rest of the world. So that collapse of complexity of civilization is probably expected sooner or later. And it doesn't really speak necessarily of a failure of that society, and certainly not the people making it up.
Why do you think this system worked? I mean, it kind of snapped into place around the world, and it's from you're a bit of a historian. You've looked a lot at our culture and our technologies and everything. Why is this working right now? In the way that it is. There's lots of things that don't work, but it's quality of life across the planet is the highest it's ever been. There's the lowest level of poverty. Like, why do you think this is working?
Yeah, so historians and anthropologists have looked at that question. Why do civilizations fail? Why do some fail and others succeed? Jared Diamond has written a book called Collapse. Joseph Traynter has written a slightly more sort of academic, formal treatment of the same thing. And to summarize and be relatively simplistic about it, civilizations fail when they start expanding and sort of overreaching the natural environment and their ability to support them, or they become too complex and therefore overly sensitive to sort of perturbations or wobbles to the system. So if there is a volcano erupts and you get a couple of years of bad winters, bad harvest, that can be enough to shake the foundations of the entire system. So it's sort of cascade failure, so the whole house of cards starts falling down. And therefore, the more complex civilizations get, or just in general more complex that systems get, the more likely they are to a sudden catastrophic failure and not a sort of graceful, steady decline. So you could argue that today we are more vulnerable, we are more likely to undergo a sort of relatively sudden catastrophic collapse compared to, for example, 14th century Europe, when the Black Death, the bubonic plague, wiped out a third of the population overall, sometimes as high as 50%, 60% in some regions. And people just kind of, just shrugged their shoulders and gone on with it. That there wasn't a civilization collapse in that period because the system was simpler. People were more able to make and do what they needed themselves back then. Certainly far, far more capable than we are as individuals today. Like I personally don't know the first thing about how to make food come out of a farm field. I don't know how to make the things that I use and rely upon. And that's true of all of us, because that is necessarily true of all of us in order to have a complex technological industrial civilization.
I would argue you might know the first thing, but maybe not. Interesting. So this is that whole house of cards analogy where everything is just kind of stacked on top of each other. It's this beautiful, incredibly complex but fragile construct. Yeah. So looking ahead to prevention, we don't want to get to this point where this book is necessary or where similar kind of endeavors are necessary. So, excuse me, my dog is barking. So what are some pragmatic hands-on things that we can be doing right now to reduce the impact of a global catastrophe?
Well, some of the stuff I think we're all already familiar with. We need to stop environmental degradation that we as a global civilization are committing in terms of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, driving climate change, global warming, acidification of the oceans, habitat destruction, over logging of rainforest. All of this has been very well communicated to us as the general public now that these are problems and it's going to get very, very bad globally. And it is already starting to get very bad unless we start making some tough decisions and changing our lifestyle and living more within our means as a civilization and recycling more and consuming less and trying to start devolving from fossil fuels and finding alternatives. So there's this sort of simple and almost boring answer, if you like, which we already know. We have to stop stressing the system in terms of our resource use. Mm-hmm. But there's another sort of side to that question as well, which is also very interesting in terms of what could we do to try to preserve that kernel of civilization to allow it to recover or grow again afterwards if there were some kind of apocalypse. We want to try and prevent it as far as we possibly can. Of course we do. But we perhaps also want to have some kind of backup, some kind of save file that's been put somewhere nice and safe and resilient and robust so that humanity could recover quickly again if we ever needed to. And there's various organizations around the world which are starting to take that possibility or that avenue much, much more seriously in terms of doing my book, doing the knowledge, but properly, comprehensively, and gathering together all the information and the practical information that doesn't really exist in things like Wikipedia and storing that in sort of hardened bunkers, libraries which have been hardened. But not just the knowledge, but also the tools and simple technology you would need to slide back down to a simpler existence and then stop that regression, backstop it, and then start trying to recover as well. So there's several approaches to the same central core question.
And you're an advisor with an organization that's also doing like a lunar lander and like their name is escaping me right now, but they have satellites that they're designing that will have information on them. Do you remember what are they called?
Oh, so I've been loosely involved with a Israeli lunar lander private enterprise called Space IL,
Okay.
and they launched their probe. They were trying to be the first private company to land a probe on the moon. So not NASA, not the European Space Agency, but a private company. And their attempt unfortunately failed. It failed for such an easy reason when it comes to technology doing something so difficult as space exploration. And the descent motor on the probe as it was nearing the lunar surface cut out too early, and it didn't so much touch down on land, but kind of dropped. And it made a wee crater. You can see the crater in more up-to-date lunar images. But there was a copy of my book, The Knowledge, along with a whole bunch of other books and some useful information on board that lander. And the understanding is that has survived. So if you wanted to get a copy of my book, The Knowledge, you could pop over to the moon and have a read of it up there. If you found that to be more convenient than buying it online or nipping to your local bookstore. But again, it seems a bit paradoxical putting a book about how to rebuild civilization after apocalypse on the moon, which about is the most inaccessible place until you reach a very high level of technology. So it was more of a sort of public outreach type project. It was more about getting people to think through questions like this than being a genuine attempt of offering a useful repository, an accessible repository of information. And if you did want to do that, ahead. No, sorry, what were you saying, Robert?
Well, it brings me back to art. There's because you can have these underground bunkers, where the secret location, bomb proof, but that isn't a useful. That's not a useful interface with the normal person who is making decisions. Potentially, if you're owning a company that's burning tons of oil or something like that, you're not encountering that and seeing it. And for me, I'm interested in, can we create these more functional art installations in multiple cities? Like, what if they were all over the world? A beautiful structure that holds within it civilization restart tools and like the Svalbard seed bank, but here in a city, in every city, and people see them every day, and the sign in front says, we never want this to open.
Exactly. Let's make sure we do things right, so we never have to open the door to this vault.
And you pass
but I think you're absolutely right that exactly. If this were to be useful, you'd want to have a whole network of similar, if not identical, repositories, just to make sure that the average distance someone would have to travel as a survivor to their nearest one isn't going to be insurmountably great. They would have to be all over the world. But obviously having art projects and exhibitions and galleries inside a city makes a lot of sense because that's where the people are. For that very reason, you probably wouldn't want to have your civilization reboot vaults or bunkers in the city itself, because those are the first things to be targeted in a nuclear war, for example. So you might want to put it slightly, in the outskirts, slightly outside a city in the countryside, so it was still accessible and you could get to it, but it wouldn't be in the throng of things and vulnerable for that reason.
No scenario is a fun one. When we're talking,
there is no comfortable catastrophe, is there?
Right. It's not going to be as sexy as Mad Max. It's going to be bad. And I think a central theme of our show, being a type 1 planet means that the actual ecosystem itself is in equilibrium. Humans are part of the ecosystem, and we should attempt to equalize, or we should attempt to reach a state of equilibrium with that ecosystem before we really get serious about going to places like Mars. But in Origins, one of your other books, and I haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, but one of the you talk about the unique features of this planet. It's a petri dish. It's created life. So how unique is Earth? I want to get this idea across to people. Why is Earth so special? Why should we be protecting it?
Well, if we're thinking about the possibility of life on other planets, so coming back to astrobiology, a key question there is Earth special? Is there something particular, if not even unique, about our planet that has made it ideally set up for an origin of life, for turning chemistry into biochemistry in the very first cells, or for then the maintenance and nurturing of that life over billions and billions of years? Is there something special about the Earth that has allowed that process for intelligent humans like you or I to invent webcams, computers, to be able to have conversations with us, with each other across the breadth of the planet. And certain aspects of planet Earth we believe to be relatively common around other small, rocky, terrestrial planets orbiting other suns in the galaxy. So oceans are probably pretty common. There's probably plenty of rocks that orbit the right distance from their sun, and they've had water delivered to their surface. So there's liquid water as a basic prerequisite for life. But then there seem to be other aspects of the Earth which we're not entirely sure if they are necessary or not. Earth has plate tectonics, for example, and the interaction between plate tectonics and volcanism is key to what's known as the carbonate-silicate cycle. So carbonate rocks and silicate rocks operate in a cycle which serves as a kind of natural thermostat for the entire planet. For billions of years, our planet's climate has remained pretty steady, and that's been crucial for the evolution of complex life. And we don't really know if plate tectonics are common on other Earth-like planets. It seems like Mars, which is the next door neighbor planet to the Earth, it's very Earth-like in many respects. It doesn't seem to ever have had plate tectonics. Venus, the innermost planet from us, also has never had plate tectonics, or doesn't today. So maybe plate tectonics is something special about our planet for maintaining that environment. Maybe having a large moon like we do for stabilizing the spin axis of the Earth and also keeping the climate nice and stable. Maybe that is a special feature of our planet. And the answer is we don't really know until we've been able to go out and explore space, discover planets orbiting other stars with our telescopes, seeing if they have signs of life in their atmospheres, so gases like oxygen and methane, and start gathering statistics on the number of Earth-like planets that are out there and the number of Earth-like planets which are also inhabited, which also have life on them. And that will allow us to really get down to the meat of that kind of question about how special, or how unique, or how commonplace is the Earth.
Will it be possible to with the James Webb, obviously, we're hopefully going to be able to take a look at some exoplanets. Do you think that we'll be able to determine the gaseous and atmosphere, but we'll be able to say anything about the actual surface and what's happening on the surface of these exoplanets through the James Webb? Are you aware of anything like that?
Well, the James Webb, along with other space telescopes or ground-based observatories or missions which are planned in the near-term future, are giving us the capability of reading the chemistry of the air of alien planets. Obviously, that's easier for big gas giant planets like Jupiter is. It's harder for smaller planets like the Earth, but that is within our technological reach in the coming years. So the next steps will be to not just find small, rocky, Earth-like planets in the right orbit around their star, in the habitable zone, or the Goldilocks zone of their star, where it's not too hot, not too cold for liquid water. We'll not just detect those planets are there, but then the next step is to characterize them, to read the chemistry of their atmosphere and see if we can see things like oxygen and methane in their atmosphere, in their air. But although it's technically possible to start imaging the surface of these planets and start making out the major land masses, the continents contrasting against the oceans, seeing weather systems and cloud cover on these planets, and then start seeing seasonal changes, so increase in the amount of reflectance coming off snow and ice as the planet orbits, so between summer and winter in each hemisphere. Being able to do that is technically possible, but exceedingly difficult. It would require huge arrays of space telescopes which are positioned very, very precisely in space to give you an interferometry array so that you can start trying to image the surface of other planets. So it's something we would one day like to be able to do. But, this is decades and decades in the future.
Wow. It's something to definitely look forward to, as more and more research and money and time being put into this kind of work. Because I think it gives people context. That the more we understand about the universe, the more we realize how incredible this reality is that we're all in right now.
And how incredible the Earth is as well, as you're saying. Like how much we really stand to lose if we screw it up here. Like, people like Elon Musk are talking about sending people to Mars and to the moon and colonizing them. And I mean, sure, we will get around to that sooner or later, but it doesn't offer an alternative to preserving the Earth as well. Trying to colonize Mars is so much more difficult
Mm.
than trying to keep the Earth a habitable place for everyone that lives here already.
So let's talk about the end of your book. There's a one of my favorite quotations in there from T.S. Eliot. He says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." And I just wanted to ask you, what is the significance of this quote in the context of this book, the context of your life, of this work, and restarting civilization?
Sorry, Rob. Could you? We can edit this bit out. Could you repeat that quote again? Because my mind was thinking that there's a different T.S. Eliot quote as well in the other book
all right, yeah.
These fragments I shore against the future or something.
Yep, yeah. The fragments shorn against these fragments I've shorn against my ruin or our ruins.
Yes.
But yeah, the quote is, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." So, what is the significance of this quote in the context of this book, but also in your life, and what does this have to do with restarting civilization?
Yeah, so we mentioned already that my sort of guiding principle for writing the knowledge, but also Origins, that the more recent book, was to take things that we take for granted, the commonplace, the everyday, and look at them from a different perspective. Make them feel strange and unfamiliar and funny. So we ask the question, why do we do it that way rather than a different way? And then that's the idea about exploring the world around us and, effectively coming back to where we started. That we can explore all of this that we take for granted in the world around us and see how that historical progression happened in order to understand the here and the now. Why is our world built the way it is in terms of our technological development, which I explore in the knowledge, or also planetary processes, which I explore in Origins? It's all about trying to understand, ourselves and our place in the world. And when you wrap in astrobiology, our place in the cosmos, our place in the universe as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, you might need to edit this back out. You might be able to hear a screaming baby now.
No, I'm not going to edit it out because it's beautiful. It's exactly what we're talking about. And before
in which case, we should maybe reference to it so it doesn't seem weird.
Yeah, but we were talking about before the interview that we both just had babies in the last year and a half. Mine was 14 months, yours is 7 months, and it makes it real. It makes the life beyond your life real. And
it's the next generation, right? Isn't it? That is why we are trying to preserve all of this. It's for the next generation. It's for Sebastian screaming as long as out.
That's why we're doing it. Sebastian over there, trying to figure it out. And it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. And I hope that we can cross paths again in the future. The point of this podcast is also to develop new connections and break down barriers between different people who have similar missions and different approaches. And so Lewis, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it. And before we get going,
I've really enjoyed
what
this
are
chat.
You working on now? What are your
really
links
to me as well?
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Tell our audience, what are you working on now? Things that we can leave in the show notes. How can people get in touch with you? That kind of information.
Oh, so I've tried to make it as easy as possible to find me on the internet, find me on Google. So just search for Lewis Dartnell. It'll take you to lewisdartnell.com. There's my website there. It talks about what I'm doing academically in terms of my research in astrobiology. There's some stuff on the new book, which I'm editing right now. The draft's been finished. The publisher's sending it back to me. This new book is called Being Human, How Our Biology Shaped World History. So I'm coming back to my biological roots for this new book. And seeing how aspects of us as a species, of our humanness, have been fundamental, again, in what we've been able to accomplish and the progression of history. So aspects of mutations in our genetics or our physiology or our psychology and cognitive biases, and exploring all of that to, again, as you say, to hold a mirror up to ourselves to hopefully better understand where we are now.
And where did these weird brains come from?
Exactly.
That kind of stuff.
Why do we evolve high intelligence in the first place? Yeah.
Right. Oh, well, I'm really looking forward to that book. Everyone keep your eyes out for that. And Lewis, thank you again. Go be with Sebastian. I'll go find Hugo, and I really appreciate your time.
It is bath time now. All right. Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thank you.